Hello, today we're going to be doing some testing on thermal solutions inside my computer case. Recently I did a video on airflow across the CPU cooler for how much extra performance you could get by adjusting the airspeed when it hits the CPU cooler. So in that test, I only varied the RPMs of the front fans. I left the bottom fans at a constant speed. Today we're doing a little bit more of an extensive test where I'm going to be running my whole system, changing from no fans to one fan to two fans. I'm going to use the center one for one, front and back, these two for two, and then all three. And I'm going to be running just the front fans, no bottom fans, and then all three all together at variable RPMs, and then letting the system do what I've specified within my fan profiles, and showing different temperatures of different components. This is an ongoing series of tests for how airflow through the case adjusts thermal performance of your CPU cooler and your GPU while maintaining a constant RPM on both the CPU and the GPU without those varying at all. So let's get right into the testing. Okay, so I'm running a series of tests right now. Right now the fans are all off. We can check that. Well, not all off. I have the CPU set to 60%. I have the GPU set to 60%. Both of the GPU PWM fan signals. And then we can check the CPU over here in Cinebench. I am running it. I'm not going to alter it, but I'm running it with 6 threads because I wanted to set a limit on my wattage. I didn't want it to be too crazy high in terms of its overall power draw. So that's why that was chosen. I need to set it to rerun and let everything stabilize. And then we're going to monitor the temperatures and see how the system does with different fan configurations. So let's get started. So now that everything is clearly running again, we've got the GPU temperatures. That's going to be in FirmArc. We've got the Cinebench R23. I set the 6 threads. Most gaming PCs are like 6 threads. Mine's an 8 thread. But the point was to not like have crazy wattage. But I also wanted it to be like a not GPU bind, CPU doing absolutely nothing, like essentially idling. When I ran 3D Mark, I was finding that the CPU wasn't really being loaded. So I'm doing this composite test while trying to get the CPU to load up. And where's the CPU? 53%. So, the CPU is having to work, but it's not going crazy at 100%. So it's a somewhat realistic overall thermal load within the case itself. So we can see how temperatures handle inside the case. And we'll monitor temperatures. It's got a 5-minute run. That should be long enough to load up the cooler. And I'll see you in a second when it's all done. Alright, this next one I'm doing while there's still some time left because I want to talk through it. So I've got my custom fan curves. So right here are the front fans. They just scale from low to high. Actually, they probably don't even register anything till they're at like 40%. I probably should just update that. So a slow increase, and then once the CPU hits like 86, 87 degrees, it just pumps them up full power very quickly, because at that point it needs some pretty extreme cooling. The CPU, I'm letting it run exactly how it wants to go. For comparison's sake, the bottom fans have their own curve as well, starting at about 30%, bumping up to 40. Actually, I should just start that at 40% because they don't do anything, but anyways. And then a slow increase, and then it spikes up when the GPU gets really hot, because honestly I find the GPU fans to be noisier this run. This is the very last, so it's just kind of to like final comparison. And I'm leaving this up so you can see what the fan curves are doing as we're ramping or finishing this out. Let's scroll down. Okay, and finally the SSDs are a little bit cooler now. So 72, 74. There's the last of it. All right, now that I showed off a little bit of the testing, I'm going to have probably more of it at the end of this video. If you're curious about actually like watching each of the segments, they'll be at the very end after I've like announced my conclusion. But for sake of kind of what we're going to be talking about further on as we go forward, motherboard slash heatsink location. So the CPU socket is there, and then we have basically the cooler is the yellow, the 2 RAM sticks in the 2 greens, the SSD, which is the T-Force, is the dark purple. The 980 Pro is this lightish pink, violet, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, the red is the GPU, and the blue should be the motherboard chipset temperature readout, just for, well, where each of the temperature readings are going to be read on the motherboard, or actually in the components, for each of the tests. And of course, we got the 2 fans in the front and the 3 fans in the bottom, and we're going to be testing out how all the airflows flow. I also wanted to comment that originally when I was doing this test, I planned on using a 3D Mark test to do the tests, and I found that it just wasn't loading the CPU as much, and I really wanted to test something where you have a more of a CPU load, so something would be like 50% of the CPU needing to cycle up in order to run the game, while the GPU would be flat out maxed out, as opposed to being 100% GPU limited. So I wanted it more like a mixed bag. So I ended up running R23 mixed with what's it called, like Furmark. Alright, first up we got GPU clock speed versus temperature and GPU wattage versus temperature. Now I did lock the GPU and the CPU fans both at 60% realistically to not cause the GPU to overheat. I'd want those fans to be more like 70 to 80% in this kind of testing. So if I ever do this test again, I'd go and do that. But so that's why a lot of these you see a large improvement in wattage as we increase the PWM fan signaling between each of the tests and increase the RPMs and adding more fans without any temperature difference in the GPU, because realistically the fans on the GPU itself are not spinning fast enough to prevent it from getting too hot. Now this is not how I run my system, like, ever. This was just for testing purposes. So the purpose of the test was to show how adjusting different fans inside the case improve the thermal solution inside of it. So whether that be the GPU or the CPU. So the results actually do make quite a bit of sense, and that is the CPU clock speed versus the CPU TIN and CPU wattage versus TIN. Now I didn't take the results versus CPU temperature as read out by like on the socket, simply because that temperature is locked on my computer. So it's always set to go to the maximum, 9 degrees. And one thing that I forgot to mention over here is the orange dot is my auto setting. So this allows the GPU and CPU fans to do whatever they need to do to maintain temperatures. So that's where I get the highest clock speed on the GPU at the lowest temperatures, which makes sense because the fans ramp up to what they need to go to. So there is a level of effectiveness. Mind, the wattage ends up being identical, but the clock speed improves. Go figure, must be temperature related, but that's the values that I was able to monitor. And when we do 2 fans, here's the red line. So kind of bounced around in there. We see the clock speed overall improving, and we do see the improvement in wattage and overall reduction in the CPU TIN temperature for these improvements in wattage that the CPU was drawing, and that's related to clock speed. When we bumped it up to 3 fans, it had a little bit of jingle jangles bouncing around in there, but overall we saw the same sort of improvement. The best results for the CPU were adding in those front fans. It just greatly improved the clock speed overall, and then of course there's a limit to how high clocks you can get. But we do see that improvement in clock speed and wattage that the CPU was drawing as we moved along. And either way, at 100%, it met the same clock speed that my auto featurette. Same with all fans, or front fans going at maximum, it met the same clock speed that my auto setting does, which allows the CPU to boost as high as it can, because like the CPU cooler and GPU cooler are just doing exactly their own things. And so once again, we are saying that as we increase fan speed, we do see improvements in clock speed and in the computer's ability to draw a higher wattage if necessary. Of course, every system is a little bit different. If your system doesn't need to draw as high as wattage, it's not going to be putting out as much heat, yada, yada, yada. But everything is kind of scales accordingly, no matter what kind of system you have. Now we're taking a look at CPU clock speed versus PWM fan signaling. So we have the different PWM signals down at the bottom, and we have the different clock speeds on the vertical. And this is PWM fan signal for whatever fan is being tested. So that's 1 fan, 2 fan, 3 fan, the front fans, all fans, and well, the auto is just a dot. And the auto kind of looked like 90%. It never really reached 100%, so I'm calling it 90% just for sake of argument here. So we see clock speed starts off all at the same point, which makes sense because it's the same testing point. And then as we ramp up the fans, we see that the best way to get cooling for your CPU is with direct airflow, which makes sense. We're talking air coolers. I need to remember to specify that we're talking air coolers. So that makes sense. The air flowing past the cooler from the front to the back is going to be most effective at cooling it. Now, next best is all fans. Ironically, it's not, it starts off at 40%, being more effective than the front fans. But I think that the effect of the bottom fans blowing extra air into the case kind of mixes things up a little bit. So if you're actually doing CPU heavy loads, you're better off not running those bottom fans. They just actually didn't help it quite as much. Mind, this is like all things equal. Again, the CPU fans were fixed at 60%. So if your CPU fans are already maxed out at a fairly low RPM and you need extra cooling, direct cooling is more effective than adding bottom cooling. But obviously having a higher CFM volume, so CFM is a volumetric flow rate. So 3 fans, so let's actually look at the green line, adds a lot more of effectiveness, total airflow, than fewer. So even indirect, adding a lot of extra volumetric flow rate, just a lot of extra air into the case, really does actually help out temperatures initially, but it's not as effective as a direct airflow. So I want to bring this up for those of you who like the O11 Dynamic, where it's got the side intake fans. Even though there's a GPU in the way, yes, I know it's not quite apples to apples, but it's a similar type idea where the fans are not in the same direct line as the CPU. So they will help, but they're not as effective as having fans in direct line. But initially, because there's so much extra air from those 3 140s, which have a higher volumetric flow rate total than 2 180s. So, you do the math, and then finally the 180s like catch up and win because, again, direct airflow. All right, now we're taking a look at CPU wattage versus PWM and GPU wattage versus PWM. So the PWM, again, is the bottom, and the wattage is the vertical. And we have the different color lines for each of the different tests. So we see 1 fan. And again, this is different than clock speed. Wattage, I feel, is actually more reliable than clock speed to register. We see the blue line. It is lagging behind the others. And then we have the red line. And 1 fan actually ended up being slightly more effective than the red. And it's interesting. Don't know exactly why. But then we got 1 red. And at 100%, it beats it out. Then we got 3 bottom fans, which starts off significantly better. And then it kind of, we're going to say that that's more or less a tie. When we have direct airflow, that's the 2 front fans. You can see it starts off roughly the same at 40%. They also have at the same point at 0. And it quickly does better, ending up at basically the same wattage point as an auto setting. So allowed in the test, I was only running 6 threads, so that the CPU wasn't boosting like crazy towards the maximum, trying to go to 250 watts or whatever it can. So it was already restricted like 200 as its peak, and I tested that on purpose with the auto setting. to get that restriction. But it allowed the CPU to boost that high, which is realistically what I think you'd see in most modern games, is this sort of behavior. And again, I think most common CPUs right now on like the Steam survey are like in the 6-core range. So again, this is perfectly like common, or at least 6 power cores. And then kind of the funny result is the all fans. The fact that there's a 10-watt difference is outside error. So I do think that the bottom fans actually just kind of ended up messing up the airflow through the case, making it so that the direct airflow from the front to the back just ended up not working as well. So this is a case of balancing airflow in your case appropriately. So realistically, I wouldn't want the bottom fans to be running too fast to cool things. Now, let's take a look at the GPU, because maybe we'll see something different. I've been focusing on the CPU for a couple minutes now. So there we go. It climbed nicely up to where its peak was in the auto setting. So that means that it was able to reach a thermal threshold to boost as high as the system would allow it, 100% basically. Using 3 fans, we got it almost as high, but it ended up not. I think that was just an error within testing. So there's that. Adding in the front fans, it started off doing really quite well, but it actually leveled out. I think that we can ignore the drop overall. It should be more or less a flat line. Again, run-to-run variance, like same thing we saw on the CPU. But basically, there's a limit to how effective the front fans can be at cooling it, and especially in this case, even with one of the fans being basically directly blowing past the GPU. But that is an interesting result, because it does mean that front-to-back airflow, so as long as there's enough space underneath your GPU to supply it fresh air, is almost as effective as having fans underneath it blowing into it. Almost as effective. Airflow really is overall effective. And for the GPU, the best results did come from all the fans running together. So this is where it's a pretty interesting result. For the CPU, it sacrificed all the fans running together, where at the high end is not quite as effective. But on the early stages, it's more effective, while for the GPU, it's very effective the entire time. So again, it's balancing out your system's airflow. Then we have PWM versus R23 results and PWM versus FPS results. I decided to make bar graphs for this one for like ease of reading stuff. The orange line is only in one location, and that's the auto setting. So we do see that the auto setting doesn't have the best result. Again, this is where, test variances as PWM goes up. And as we add more fans, we also see that general improvement. Interestingly, 2 bottom fans did better than 3 bottom fans, and better than front-to-back airflow, despite the higher wattage. I don't know what's going on. But, there's a general improvement, and we see that the front fans being more effective than the bottom fans. PWM versus FPS. Again, we get to see the same general kind of improvements, but overall, other than no extra airflow into the case, so that means the case was just a hot box. There was no airflow in and out other than what the CPU was drawing out of the case through the back. So in other words, the only fan that was actually kicking air out the back of the case was the CPU, while the GPU was just kind of kicking air all around the case, and whatever would go out the back would go out the back. So we see it locked, and just adding a little bit of airflow other than one bottom fan would start to improve things. But the best improvement is from the front fans. So front fans, we see the most immediate results until we start getting to higher PWM fan signals. So testing out my computer's thermals, currently no fans running. CPU 70%, GPU fans 70%. Thermal test, one fan running, bottom middle. One bottom fan, 50%. One bottom fan running 60%. Total system thermal test, bottom fan running 70%. One bottom fan running 80%. One bottom fan running 90%. Test two bottom fans, 40%. No front. Two bottom fans running 50%. Two bottom fans running 60%. Two bottom fans running 80%. Two bottom fans running 80%. Two fans 90%. Three fans 40%. Bottom only. Three fans 50%. Three bottom fans 60%. Bottom fans 70%. Three fans 80%. Three by 90%. Front fans 40% only. Front fans 50%. Front fans 60% only. Front fans 70%. Front fans 80%. Front fans 90%. Front and bottom 40%. All fans 50%. Front and bottom 60%. All fans 70%. All fans 80%. All fans 90%. Computer custom fan profile. Okay, just a reminder for what the different heat generating components are, or where I should say, the components that I'm reading temperatures from are. So RAM sticks over here, we got the T-Force right there, the A44 or 440, the 980 Pro, and the motherboard chipset. So now we got RAM temperature 1 and RAM temperature 2. So we increase the fan RPM. We do see a tendency for the RAM temperature to go down, even with indirect airflow. So they did actually increase in temperature, and I think some of the reason for that is more heat is being kicked up towards the top of the case because, again, I'm not drawing it out, especially with the bottom fans running. So it's not being drawn out quickly enough. So the temperatures would increase before finally decreasing. So which ones have the best decrease in temperatures? Well, all fans running is the very best. Now let's make sure we're taking a look at both of these at once. I'm getting sidetracked by looking only at one. So next best I'm going to say is front to back airflow. So 3 fans, slightly better overall, but 3 fans on the bottom. So in maximum indirect flow or front to back airflow, direct flow. So that ends up being the best results. Here are the different results, different heat generating components, the two SSDs. So we get the temperature of the main board, and we got the temperature of the CPU TIN versus PWM fan signaling, and 1 fan at the bottom. We add, where's the red line? There's the red line. 2 fans at the bottom. So second place. 3 fans, ironically, are overall slightly better than only the front fans, although they end up at the same place. So that is a pretty interesting result. But again, these temperatures are all perfectly safe for motherboards. So it's just like, what is the best temperature that we can get? These are all perfectly, even it, like with no airflow, is a safe temperature, ironically, for the motherboard. But the best results is all fans running. And then the CPU TIN, we do see that with 1 fan running, it's a flat line, and then finally there's enough airflow in it that we see an improvement in temperatures. It's actually increased in temperature before finally dropping again and then ending up where it is. 3 bottom fans followed a much steeper drop, and only front fans really had the best drop overall. So for the CPU TIN, all front fans, best result, other than having all the fans running at 100%. And of course, the absolute best is the auto setting right there. All right. Again, reminder of where the different parts are, the different colors. And now we have the different M.2s. So again, the light pink is underneath the GPU, and the purple is over the GPU, between the GPU and the CPU sockets. So we got 1 fan running, and we see an overall improvement in temperature. For 2 fans running the red line, we see an overall improvement in temperature, a bit quicker overall, some random offset points, but overall an improvement in temperature quicker. 3 fans running, greatly improved temperature more quickly. And all fans was the absolute best, while the worst was actually the front fans running. Now, as for the T-Force 1, which is in between the GPU and the CPU, well, it's in a much more cramped space. Again, all the temperatures start off at the same place. So adding 1 fan, we saw an increase and then a pretty stark decrease actually in temperature. Adding 2 fans leveled it out. I suspect that something else was going on with the blue line where it just wasn't ended up being loaded up or something like that. But eventually it dropped. Adding 3 fans, saw the best on the bottom. So I think just managed to finagle its way around the GPU or something like that. Front fans, which is what I actually expected to be the best, was kind of in the middle overall. And adding all the fans ended up with the best results. Once again, because maximum airflow. This is the SSD that has the highest temperatures. So adding in that extra cooling around it is definitely a big bonus. All right, now we're going on to CPU performance. R23% improvement versus original at 0% PWM fan signaling. So this is how much does it improve versus like no fan results. Well, 3 fans ends up not actually the best, while 2 fans ends up being the best overall. 1 bottom fan, all fans, not quite the best. So the best overall is, of course, just the front fans. So if we take a look at the GPU, so this is percent improvement in FPS. 1 bottom fan ended up being slightly worse than no fans at all. Go figure. Until we reach very high PWM fan signaling, so an improvement there. 2 fans, been more effective. 3 fans, more effective. Front fans, similar but not quite as good overall as 3 fans. And then all fans. We got CPU/GPU performance improvement, R23 versus FPS. We're looking at the same data just from a slightly different perspective. So you'll notice R23 and FPS, R23 and FPS. So it's the same data, just looking at it a little bit differently. And GPU is in red and CPU is in blue. So it tells us what percentage improvement we're seeing at each of the data points. Just if your case only has front and bottom fan slots, you're better off optimizing the front fans for good airflow than to add a bottom fan. If you already have all the fans, then you still want to optimize it for good airflow, but overall the most important airflow is that front to back airflow for cooling an air-cooled CPU and an air-cooled GPU. So just making sure that all the components have as fresh a supply as air as possible. I mean, duh, right? But it was, do bottom fans, are they more effective or less effective or equally effective as that front to back airflow? And overall, we are seeing, again, going back to this, that a front to back airflow and greater than 1 fan on the bottom, so 2 fans to 3 fans on the bottom, is just as effective as a good front to back airflow at providing that GPU with sufficient airflow. Next, we're taking a look at CPU, GPU performance improvement as wattage. So which one did we see the best gains in wattage? So all fans, just front fans, 3 bottom fans, 2 bottom fans, 1 bottom fan. So obviously the CPU gets the best improvement for front to back airflow. GPU got the best improvement from 3 bottom fans and 2 bottom fans. So adding in front fans is somewhere in between 2 fans and no fans. So, it's this balancing act, once again, that I'm like talking about. It's like enough airflow going into the case directed in the right spot. is really what you need, is enough air getting to where it needs to go. Right, next we have a lot of data all at once. We got across the board at the top, we have the 980 Pro, then in the middle we got the T-Force SSDs, then we got the GPU temperature, we got the RAM temperature, we got RAM temperature, we got the motherboard temperature, and the CPU TIN temperature. And this is at just 40, 60, 80, and 100% PWM fan signaling, with each of the different tests. So that's all fans, just front fans, 3 fans bottom, 2 fans, 1 fan bottom, in the different colors. So again, this is how much improvement you see for each of the components at different PWM fan signals for the different, as we go across, and vertically within each group for the different tests. So again, directly for the CPU, starting off at lower audio is the best, but all the fans, and we basically see very little improvement. For the CPU temperature, the motherboard gets immediate improvement just by adding any amount of airflow with 3 fans, so maximum volumetric flow rate into the case being the best, followed by front to back and 2 bottom fans. No improvement for the RAM, really, for any of them. For 40%, GPU, again, basically got no improvement. The SSDs, only the middle one, or the one trapped in the middle, got any improvement, and it got the best improvement. We're going to ignore all fans. From 3 fans at the bottom, and actually it didn't do as well with the front. At 90%, we see the overall improvement, actually best improvement overall, where the motherboard got the best improvement, tied for 3 fans at the bottom, and the fans at the front, the CPU doing the best with the fans at the front. The RAM overall didn't really matter that much, but I'd say the fans at the front. And then 980. Ironically, I'm going to say all these are about the same. So at that point, it didn't really matter. Same with the T-Force, it didn't quite matter so much, although 2 fans at the bottom did do the best. So most computer cases with the power supply at the bottom, so you might have room for 1 fan in the front, right here, right? So the CPU will be shifted higher, so having enough airflow to get to the heat generating components, i.e. the GPU and the CPU, is really the most important factor. So with it shifted up, and let's say you've got 280s takes up the same amount of space as 3 120s. So 3 120s take up the same amount of space as 2 180s. So shifting it up will actually allow for more air to get underneath the GPU, depending on the case design, as long as it doesn't get trapped underneath the GPU shroud. So some modern cases have a little slope to help direct air up towards the GPU. That is really key. On this note, I do plan on building, it's going to be out of cardboard boxes, honestly, but a little test chamber to kind of try to simulate a computer case and airflow direction around it. If you're interested in me actually doing that, please leave comments down below, because it would take quite a bit of time to design this pseudo computer case box to adjust to be similar to multiple different kinds of cases, because realistically that's what I want it to do. So in the Torrent PC case, where the CPU socket is actually shifted down a little bit, the bottom airflow is actually quite a bit more important. So this large volume of air underneath the GPU actually helps it out significantly in this case. Depending on how much air space is between the GPU and whatever else is below it, does greatly change its effectivity, or the effectiveness of its fans. Because if you're pulling too much air in, you could actually pull a vacuum underneath it, and then you really need to make sure that you're supplying that area with enough air. So you need a really strong airflow. So in some cases, I'm talking computer cases, not test cases. So you would have 1, 2, 3 fans, and you'd want this fan synced up to GPU temperature so that it would ramp up the airflow. In my computer case, I have these 2 fans synced up to the CPU for day-to-day use, and these 3 fans synced up to the GPU. So using software that allows you to optimize the airflows of your fans for the different heat generating components is actually key to regulating the thermals inside of it. And that's really what I wanted to test today. It was just kind of this fun, weird test to show how different airflow going through your case could affect temperatures. And overall, the GPU is just affected less than other components around it. Like, just briefly going back to it. So lowest we saw was like, we're going to ignore the one fan bottom. It was 90 watts. Adding in just a few more fans brought it up to like 220. And we saw very little change in actual FPS, despite the GPU able to draw a significantly higher load. So relatively speaking, that airflow at the bottom, that extra air being supplied to it just matters just a little bit less than the CPU does. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying that it just matters a little bit less. And with that, I'm calling this an end to this video. This is the raw data. I know that's a lot of stuff going on. I just like to show off the raw data at the end of all of my videos. This testing took like 15 minutes per test. And you can see how many tests I did and tried to gather as much data as possible. So this was quite an undertaking for me. This is the first time I've done a test remotely like this. So if you've got suggestions on ways to actually do it more effectively, I'd be very interested, or even more accurately. Right now I'm just using the free version of hardware monitoring. I think the advanced version allows for like recording, but again, this is a currently non-profit channel, or no profit channel, I should say. So that's a little bit outside my purview. So I just took thermal max or temperature max as the default value that we saw, as well as for everything else. So with that, thank you for joining me on this journey on computer tech and more. If you like what I'm doing and want to see this channel grow, I encourage you to join me on Patreon or become a YouTube member or send me like some kind of super chat, whatever. If you have suggestions on content for me to cover, please leave that in the comment section down below. If you've got questions, concerns, I'm happy to answer them. Other than that, thank you for watching, and now we're going to have the rest of the test runs, I think, unless this video gets way too long, in which case I might just put into a whole separate piece with just each of the test runs back to back to back to back, and you'll hear me like talk about the runs briefly in each one. Anyways, thank you. Have a good day.